They say you can always tell when something is wrong the moment you walk through your front door. For Julia Emerson, it was the way the light hit the hallway differently. The silence. The subtle shift in the air. And then, it was the absence of something she had held dear for a lifetime. She had just returned from London, where she'd curated one of the most prestigious traveling art exhibits of her career. Her flight landed at noon, and by 2 she was unlocking the front door of the restored Charleston townhouse she had spent years preserving. The foyer welcomed her with its familiar scent of sea breeze and aged wood. But the comfort ended there. There was no sign of Brandon. No handwritten note. No rushed hug. Not even the sound of footsteps upstairs. Julia rolled her suitcase down the hallway, pausing near the cabinet in the parlor, an antique mahogany piece from her grandmother's estate. She reached for the small silver key tucked behind a candlestick and opened the glass doors. Her breath stopped. The velvet-lined case that held her heirloom jewelry was wide open. Empty. No sapphire ring her grandmother once wore during wartime galas. No gold pendant from her mother's 25th anniversary. No emerald earrings she bought after landing her first gallery director role. Gone. All of it. Julia stared at the void for a long time. Her fingers trembled as they reached toward the empty box, brushing against the indentations where her legacy used to sit. Then she heard the front door creak open. Brandon. "Hey, Jules," he said casually, tossing his keys onto the hallway table. He didn't seem startled to see her. In fact, his voice was far too cheerful. "You're home early." "I told you I'd be back today," Julia replied slowly, her tone cautious. "What happened to my jewelry?" Brandon paused, then smiled, a smug, hollow smile she had seen before, once, years ago, when he convinced a neighbor to sell him a classic car for half its value. "Ah, that," he said, walking past her into the kitchen. "I made a move while you were away." "A smart one." "I sold the collection." Julia didn't speak. Couldn't. Her brain raced to catch up with his words. He poured himself sparkling water like he had just told her the lawn was mowed. "You what?" she whispered. "I sold the jewelry," he said again, slower, as if she were hard of hearing. "You weren't using it. Most of it just sat there gathering dust. I found a buyer, well, a few. It was the perfect seed money for a venture I've been working on. You'll see. This is big, Jules. Real big." She stood frozen in place. "That collection has been in my family for generations." Brandon shrugged. "Which is exactly why it has value. You never even wore the sapphire ring. What's the point of keeping it locked away?" Julia's hands curled into fists at her sides. What he didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that Julia had not been careless with that collection. Months earlier, after a string of high-profile thefts across the East Coast, she had taken preventive measures. Using technology from the museum world, she had embedded a discrete tracking chip behind the main setting of each piece. It was a technique borrowed from art security protocols, something only curators and specialists would know. She had done it quietly, never imagining she would need it for this. Now, it was the one thing giving her hope. "I need to sit down," she said quietly, moving past him into the living room. Brandon didn't follow. He was too busy checking messages on his phone. As soon as she reached the couch, Julia pulled her own phone from her bag and opened the tracking app she had hidden in a folder marked Garden Notes. Her heart thudded as the interface loaded. Dots appeared. Glowing red beacons scattered across the Charleston map. Her grandmother's sapphire ring was at an estate auction house on King Street. The pendant was already en route to a warehouse on the industrial docks. The earrings were listed at a high-end consignment gallery in Mount Pleasant. Julia stared at the screen, a mix of relief and fury building in her chest. She had proof. Not just of where the items had gone, but of what Brandon had done. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel powerless. She called the one person who always knew what to do. "Tessa," she said when the line picked up. "It's Julia." "He sold everything." but I can find it. I need your help. There was a pause on the line, then Tessa's voice came through sharp and angry. I'm on my way. As Julia ended the call, she felt a storm rising inside her. She wasn't going to scream. Not yet. She wasn't going to cry. She was going to fight. And Brandon Cross had no idea just how much of a mistake he had made. The mirror above Julia's mantel reflected a version of herself she barely recognized. Her eyes, once soft and composed, now burned with quiet rage. Her posture had changed too, no longer the graceful stillness of an art curator but something sharper, like a sculpture mid-chisel. She stared at her reflection, as if trying to memorize this new version, the one who had just watched her world crack without breaking herself. Tessa Lane arrived less than 20 minutes later. Her long coat still clung to the damp air outside, and her heels clicked through the hallway like a countdown. Tell me everything, she said the moment she stepped inside, not even taking off her coat. Julia handed her the phone. He sold it all. Without asking. Without telling me. But the trackers are working. Tessa zoomed in on the digital map. You embedded chips in your heirlooms? Since when are you a secret agent? It's museum tech, Julia said, her voice strained. I used it on artifacts years ago. I never thought I'd need it for my own things. Tessa tapped one of the red dots. Consignment Gallery, Mount Pleasant. That's the Gilded Eye. I know the owner. She won't want stolen goods on her shelves. Julia nodded. I need to report it, Tess. Legally. I want this documented before he tries to spin the narrative. Tessa gave her a firm look. Then we go to the police first thing tomorrow. But tonight, we write down every item, every detail, and every transaction you can remember. If he forged paperwork or created fake permissions, we'll catch him in it. Hours passed. Tea went cold. Candles melted down to nubs. And Julia documented everything, from her grandmother's ring to the pearl brooch she almost gave to Brandon's mother before deciding it wasn't earned. Each piece had a story, and she recorded them all. By the time the list was complete, it felt like a personal archive of betrayal. As they sat side by side on the couch, the air between them buzzed with tension. You think he did this because of the money? Tessa asked quietly. Julia hesitated. I think he did it because he thought I wouldn't fight back. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Brandon was conveniently working late, no doubt unaware that his secret had already unraveled. Julia lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the house around her suddenly feeling like someone else's shell. Every hallway echoed with memories of being silenced, decisions made for her, dreams discarded to support his. At dawn, she dressed deliberately, navy blazer, pressed slacks, low heels. Not to intimidate. But to feel solid. She needed that now. Charleston's downtown precinct stood proud in the morning light, flanked by palmetto trees and sandstone facades. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and printer ink. The desk officer raised his eyebrows as Julia explained her situation, but he didn't laugh or dismiss her. I'd like to report a theft, she said, holding her phone tightly. My husband sold a collection of personal jewelry that belonged to me. I can prove it. I have tracking data. Within moments, she was led to a small interview room with soft walls and a single flickering light. Detective Eli Navarro entered like a shadow, calm, composed, eyes sharp but not unkind. He introduced himself and sat across from her, hands folded. Walk me through it, he said. Julia began. With each sentence, her voice steadied. She told him about the heirlooms, the technology, the night before. She showed him the app. The map. The documented list. Eli didn't interrupt. Only nodded and took notes with a deliberate, practiced hand. When she finished, he leaned back and exhaled. You weren't exaggerating, he said. This isn't just a domestic dispute. These are classified as high-value items under city code. With the tracking chips and your statement, we have grounds to open an official investigation. Do you think we can get them back? Julia asked. If the chips are still active, yes. But there's something else, Eli said, flipping through his notes. We've had recent financial flags tied to your husband's name. A private firm reported suspicious asset movements last month. It was on our radar, but nothing actionable. Until now. Julia blinked. What kind of movements? Multiple transfers through layered accounts. One routed through a holding company based in the Cayman Islands. She went cold. He always said it was just an investment. Sometimes investments are walls, Eli said simply. We'll look into it. By the time Julia left the station, the Charleston sun was high and unforgiving. She felt like she was moving underwater. The betrayal was no longer just personal. It was systemic. When she returned home, Brandon was in the kitchen, casually stirring his espresso, humming like nothing had changed. Good morning, he said. You look serious. I went to the police, Julia said plainly. Brandon froze, spoon midair. They're investigating, she continued. You didn't just sell my property. You moved money illegally. There are records. His smile cracked. You're overreacting. No, she said. I'm finally reacting. Brandon slammed the cup down. You're turning our life into a scandal. I did this for us. She stepped forward, voice low but unwavering. You did it for yourself. And I'm done watching you destroy everything I built. Brandon laughed bitterly, but it didn't reach his eyes. You think you've won because you talked to some detective? This isn't over. No, Julia said, reaching into her coat pocket and holding up the list of recovered item locations. It's just beginning. He didn't say another word. He didn't have to. Because for the first time, he realized Julia wasn't someone he could control anymore. She wasn't the woman he left behind when she boarded a plane. She was the woman in the mirror now, sharp, deliberate, and ready for war. The dots blinked steadily on Julia's screen, each one pulsing like a heartbeat across the Charleston map. It was a strange thing, watching your past move without you, like ghosts wandering through glass storefronts and loading docks. But these weren't just ghosts. These were pieces of her, handed down in velvet boxes, worn during weddings and funerals, earned through years of sacrifice and grace. And now they sat under the wrong lights, tagged with the wrong names. Julia sat in her car outside the Gilded Eye, the upscale consignment gallery nestled between a wine bar and a boutique that sold vintage umbrellas. The gold lettering on the windows gleamed under the midday sun, and behind the glass, she spotted a familiar sparkle. Her mother's diamond pendant. The same one she used to borrow on school recital nights. The same one Brandon said he didn't remember seeing in years. Tessa met her on the curb, eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. You ready? No, Julia admitted, but I'm doing it anyway. They entered the gallery together. A soft bell chimed above them. A woman in her 60s with a silk scarf and perfectly pinned gray hair approached. Her name tag read Margot, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Can I help you ladies? Julia nodded and gestured to the display case near the entrance. That necklace, the diamond pendant in the center, it belongs to me. Margot's smile tightened. Everything in our store has been vetted and documented. I assure you, this piece came from a verified seller. My husband, Julia said evenly, who sold it without my consent. And I can prove it. She pulled out her phone and opened the tracking app. A red dot pulsed exactly over the Gilded Eye's location. Then she scrolled to the photo gallery, a picture of her wearing that same pendant 6 months ago, time-stamped, geotagged. Another photo showed her grandmother handing it to her at a family gathering. Tessa crossed her arms. You might want to call your lawyer. This could become public. Margot blinked. Wait here. Minutes later, she returned with a man in a gray suit who introduced himself as the gallery's legal advisor. Julia repeated her claim, this time adding Detective Navarro's name and case number. She left nothing out, not the theft, not the tracking, not the other pieces already confirmed missing. The man didn't argue. He simply nodded and said, "We will cooperate. We don't deal in stolen property, and if this item was part of an unauthorized sale, we'll hold it in safekeeping until the investigation concludes." Julia nodded, her hands cold but steady. Reclaimed. Back in the car, Tessa sighed. 1 down. How many more to go? 7, Julia replied, eye scanning the map again. 2 are moving. 1 just pinged inside a private auction house. Which one? Rutherford and Cross, Julia said, her voice turning bitter. Tessa looked at her sharply. Wait. Isn't that? Yes, Julia said. Brandon's old business partner's company. The silence between them grew thick. Rutherford and Cross wasn't just a respected name in Charleston's art circles. It was the one Brandon always bragged about. The one that led him into the city's elite. Julia remembered the night they first hosted a gallery showing there. Brandon had made a speech, thanking Julia for being the woman behind the man. Now her jewelry was being funneled through the same building. That evening, Julia returned home alone. Brandon wasn't there. His shoes were gone from the front hall. His favorite bourbon missing from the liquor cabinet. He was hiding. Or running. She didn't care which. She opened her laptop and began drafting a formal affidavit listing her ownership of each item. She sent it to Detective Navarro along with the tracking data and photos. Minutes later, he replied. Confirmed. We are in contact with the Gilded Eye. The piece will be held pending evidence review. We've also contacted Rutherford and Cross. This may go beyond personal theft. We'll update you soon, ***. Julia sat back and exhaled. But the calm didn't last. That night, her phone lit up with a message. From Brandon. You don't know what you're doing. Stop this before it gets worse, ***. She didn't respond. Instead, she blocked the number. The next morning, Julia woke to an email from Detective Navarro. Julia, I need to speak with you today. The financial trail tied to the jewelry sales links to multiple offshore accounts under Brandon's name. Possible fraud and laundering. This case is growing, ***. She stared at the screen. Laundering. Not just betrayal. Not just theft. This was crime. She dressed quickly and met Navarro at the precinct. He looked more serious than the day before. Rutherford and Cross is cooperating, he said. They provided internal logs that show Brandon used a falsified appraisal certificate to push her items through his liquidation from a dissolved estate. We're confirming it's forgery. Julia blinked. He pretended I was dead? Navarro's expression darkened. He claimed the estate was inherited through distant family. The name on the paperwork? Julia Rose Lanning. We believe he combined your middle name with a maiden name to create a fictional signature. She sat in stunned silence. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything. You just have to keep standing your ground. That afternoon, as she walked down King Street alone, Julia caught a glimpse of herself in a shop window. Not the reflection of a woman defeated, but one of steel. Her past may have been scattered across the city, but her future was starting to take shape, sharp, deliberate, and completely her own. The Rutherford and Cross building stood like a monument to Southern wealth, white stone columns, trimmed hedges, and wrought iron gates that whispered exclusivity with every creak. To the casual observer, it was a place of sophistication, a temple of curated elegance. But to Julia Emerson it had become something else entirely. A vault for her stolen legacy. She arrived just before noon, armed with a printed copy of the email thread with Detective Navarro and her affidavit. The tracking app still showed a pulsing red dot inside the building. Her sapphire ring. The one passed down from her grandmother, worn during the war, smuggled from Europe in a coat lining, then handed to Julia the night she left for college. And now, it sat behind someone else's glass. A young assistant greeted her at the entrance. Can I help you? I'm here to speak with Mr. Grant Langford, Julia replied, her voice calm but edged with steel. He's the current director. He's expecting me. She wasn't sure if that was true, but Navarro had assured her that her name had been passed along. The assistant hesitated, then motioned her toward a marble-tiled hallway. Inside the private meeting room, Langford waited, tall and dapper in his charcoal suit, his silver cufflinks flashing like a warning. His expression was unreadable, but Julia knew men like him. Polished exteriors, guarded words, and a deep loyalty to silence. Miss Emerson, he said, offering a hand she did not take. Detective Navarro informed me you'd be arriving. I'm here about my sapphire ring, Julia replied, sliding the affidavit across the table. It was never meant to be sold. My husband forged documentation and passed it through your auction as part of a fake estate. Langford skimmed the papers, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. I see, he said after a moment. The piece was scheduled for private auction next week. It has not yet been transferred to a buyer. Then you can return it. Miss Emerson, he said carefully, we are cooperating with law enforcement. However, you must understand, our reputation relies on discretion and clean documentation. If this goes public. Public, she interrupted. You're worried about reputation? My husband created a corpse estate using my name. He's laundering money through your auction house. And you're concerned about whispers? Langford met her eyes, and for a moment, something cracked beneath his practiced calm. Do you know how many names come through here every month? He asked quietly. Do you know how many stories we hear, estranged heirs, private collectors, disputed claims? Half our job is deciding who's lying. Well, I'm not lying, Julia snapped. And if you can't see that, you're complicit. Langford didn't respond. He reached for a folder behind him and opened it. Inside was a high-resolution photo of the ring. Julia's ring. Underneath was a description, typed in professional jargon, calling it a vintage European sapphire in platinum claw setting, circa 1939. No mention of its history. No mention of her family. He pushed it toward her. You'll be contacted by our legal team. Until then, the item will be withheld from sale. That's all I can guarantee. It wasn't an apology. But it was a start. As she left the building, Julia felt like she'd wrestled a stone from a mountain, one piece down, many more to go. She called Tessa the moment she got back to her car. How bad was it? Her friend asked. Like negotiating with a statue, Julia said, slamming the door shut. But they're holding the piece. I've got the photo. It's something. You're making a paper trail, Jules. That's how you win. Keep moving. Julia glanced at the map again. A new red dot was flickering now, one of the pendants, pinging from an upscale warehouse in the coastal district. But something about it felt off. The signal kept moving every few hours. Too fast. Too clean. She flagged the location in the app and sent the coordinates to Navarro. Less than an hour later, her phone rang. Julia, Navarro's voice came through, tighter than usual. That signal you sent. It's not just jewelry. We're tracking a pattern now. Multiple items, not just yours, are being funneled through the same warehouse. Paintings, watches, gold bars. This isn't a single incident. It's part of a laundering chain. Her pulse spiked. Are you saying Brandon's part of a ring? We don't know yet, Navarro said. But the shell companies tied to the warehouse match some of the financial records we pulled from Brandon's accounts. This goes far beyond stolen heirlooms. Julia sat back, staring out at the Charleston harbor. The waves moved slowly, but underneath, a riptide was forming. I'm going to lose my mind if I don't do something, she said. Navarro paused. Then let me give you a next step. Tomorrow morning, I want you at our office. Bring everything. We're filing for emergency injunctions. If we move fast, we can freeze the auction lot and access the warehouse. She agreed without hesitation. That night, Julia couldn't sleep. She walked her house room by room, touching objects that still belonged to her. Framed art. A favorite mug. The creaky wood of the banister. Brandon hadn't taken those, not yet. But the more she looked, the more she realized how little of this house felt like hers anymore. In the hallway mirror, she caught her own eyes. She wasn't afraid. She was furious. And fury, when aimed well, could be precision. Her story wasn't about a lost ring anymore. It was about every lie hidden under polished stone. Every false signature. Every name forged to silence a woman who knew too much. They thought they could erase her. Instead, they were going to watch her rise. Julia arrived at the precinct just as the rain began to fall, soft and steady like the prelude to a storm. Charleston's historic streets, once charming and warm, now looked slick and secretive under the low gray sky. Detective Navarro met her in the main lobby, his expression as unreadable as always, but today there was something different in his voice, urgency. Injunctions were filed at dawn, he said, leading her past a bank of closed doors. We've issued a freeze on 3 of Brandon's known accounts and a temporary halt on all auction activity tied to the forged estate. Julia followed him through a narrow corridor and into a back office where a young agent was already printing documents from a secure terminal. On the screen were wire transfers, asset sheets, and a name Julia had never seen before, Crestone Holdings. "What is that?" she asked, pointing. Navarro didn't hesitate. "A shell company registered in Nevada. Paper trail connects it to Brandon's email. It was used to quietly transfer funds from jewelry sales into off-the-record investments." "So he created a ghost business," she muttered. "Exactly," Navarro replied. "He moved the money fast, but we were faster. As of this morning, those accounts are locked. No withdrawals, no access. He'll find out soon enough." Julia felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it was fleeting. "What about the warehouse?" she asked. Navarro exchanged a glance with the younger agent before answering. "We've secured a limited search order. It's not full access, but it's a start. We'll be there by noon. I'd like you to come." Julia nodded. "I'm in." The rest of the morning was a blur of paperwork, signatures, and evidence prep. Navarro walked her through every detail, ensuring that her claim wasn't just emotional, it was bulletproof. They included timestamps from the tracking app, original appraisals, and photographs of her wearing the items. Each document became a brick in the wall they were building around Brandon's lies. By the time they arrived at the warehouse district, the rain had thickened to a misty drizzle. The structure itself was unassuming, long, flat, gray, with a single steel door and a keypad lock. Navarro knocked twice. A warehouse manager, clearly rattled by the badge, let them in without a word. Inside, rows of crates and locked glass cabinets stretched from one wall to another. It felt more like a vault than a warehouse. A vault for secrets. Navarro's team moved quickly, checking serial numbers and scanning items against the stolen asset list. Julia stood still in the center, heart racing, as the red dot on her phone brought her to a long metal shelf. There, carefully labeled, was a white satin box. She reached out, slowly, and opened it. Her grandmother's pearl hair comb glowed softly against the fabric. Julia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her fingers brushed the edge, cool and smooth and real. The comb had survived world wars, fires, even a flood. And now, it had survived Brandon. Navarro approached behind her. "That's confirmation number 4. All pieces recovered so far are being held for official transfer once legal proceedings move forward." Julia nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked her toward a glass case in the corner, inside were items she didn't recognize. But the tags bore familiar descriptions. Signed paintings. Gold watches. A sapphire cufflink set, still in original packaging. "These aren't yours," Navarro said, "but they're connected to Brandon. He's been moving more than just your jewelry." Julia looked closer, reading a tag, Estate of B. Emerson, deceased. She stiffened. He's selling from me as if I'm dead. Navarro's voice dropped. It's a common laundering tactic. Forge a death certificate, claim the estate, transfer assets under proxy companies. Usually works when no one checks the paper trail. But I'm alive, Julia said bitterly. Navarro gave her a long look. Exactly. And now you're fighting back. Which makes you very dangerous to men like Brandon. As they stepped outside into the gray afternoon, Julia's phone buzzed. A new message. Blocked number. You've made your point. But if you keep this up, you'll destroy everything, including what's left of your reputation. I built that life. Don't forget it, ***. She showed it to Navarro. Is this a threat? Not yet, he replied. But it's a sign he's cornered. That night, back at home, Julia poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the fire. She didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. But she felt solid. Like the first stones of a foundation had been laid. Tessa called just before 10. How'd it go? They froze everything, Julia said, staring at the flames. He can't touch $1. They found more items. The pearl comb, the painting tags. He forged me as dead, Tess. There was silence on the other end. You still okay? Tessa finally asked. Julia hesitated, then nodded slowly. No. But I will be. After the call, she walked to the cabinet where the empty jewelry box still sat. It was no longer a symbol of loss. Now, it was a reminder of what was coming back. And of what was no longer his to take. Brandon Cross prided himself on control. On reading the room, charming the skeptics, and always staying 3 steps ahead. But by the end of the week, control had slipped through his fingers like wet sand. And the cracks in his carefully crafted empire were widening faster than he could patch them. The morning began with headlines. Charleston art financier under investigation for fraudulent estate sales. Private auctions frozen amid probe into alleged asset laundering. Julia scrolled through the articles, her name absent, but the pieces unmistakably hers. The media had picked up Navarro's investigation quicker than anyone expected. Rutherford and Cross had released a cautious statement of full cooperation, while Crestone Holdings' digital presence vanished overnight. The shell had collapsed. Tessa arrived at Julia's house before noon, holding 2 lattes and a folder filled with legal updates. They found 5 more fake accounts, she said without even sitting. One routed through the Bahamas, another in Singapore. Navarro thinks Brandon was preparing to disappear. Julia blinked. You mean, vanish? Tessa nodded. If the auction had gone through, and the money landed clean, he could have left the country. Started over. With your family's legacy in his pocket. Julia set down her coffee, her fingers shaking. I thought he just wanted money, she whispered. Tessa's voice softened. He wanted power. You just got in the way. That afternoon, Julia met Navarro in a quiet room at the Charleston courthouse. Papers were signed, orders reviewed, and official recovery filings submitted. The comb, the ring, the pendant, they were all listed, logged, and soon to be returned. We've also filed preliminary charges, Navarro said, flipping through a thick manila folder. Forgery. Fraud. Theft. Obstruction. The DA is preparing a full indictment. Julia stared at the words as if they were in another language. He's going to be arrested? Navarro nodded. That's the plan. The timing depends on the judge. Julia exhaled slowly, watching the raindrops slide down the courthouse window like ink on parchment. That evening, the confrontation came. Brandon returned home without warning. Julia heard the door open and close with a kind of violence that didn't need sound to announce itself. He stepped into the kitchen, soaked from the rain, eyes wild, jaw locked. You froze everything, he said quietly. You lied about everything, Julia replied, not rising from her chair. He stepped closer. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've humiliated me. You've burned down everything I built. She looked up at him, calm, almost bored. You built it with stolen wood. You think you're clever, he spat. Going to the police, digging through accounts like some kind of prosecutor. You don't understand what kind of people you've crossed. She stood, meeting him eye to eye. Oh, I understand, she said, voice cold. I understand perfectly. You built an empire on other people's names, and you tried to bury me under it. But I had the receipts. I had the truth. And now you have nothing. Brandon's mask cracked. You don't know what I did to protect you, he growled. You protected yourself, she said. And when that didn't work, you tried to erase me. But you underestimated the woman you married. He went silent. For the first time since it all began, his rage flickered into something else, fear. You think they'll listen to you forever? He hissed. One article, one headline, and they'll turn. They always do. Julia shook her head slowly. I don't need headlines. I have the law. Brandon didn't argue. He turned, stormed out the door, and left muddy footprints in the hallway, one final stain she would clean on her terms. The next morning, Navarro called. It's happening today, he said. Brandon will be served and taken in for questioning. You may be asked to testify later. Are you ready for that? Julia looked around her home, now quiet, orderly, hers again. I'm ready. She dressed not for war, but for closure. A deep green dress, soft and elegant, the color of resilience. She tied her hair back and went to the gallery where she once curated dreams. The director, a gentlewoman named Evelyn, welcomed her with open arms. We heard, Evelyn said softly. If you need time off. I don't, Julia replied. I need to hang something on the east wall. Evelyn paused, then smiled. Go ahead. Julia walked to the long, clean space near the front, unpacked a small, velvet-lined case, and opened it. Inside was the pearl comb, recovered, cleaned, glowing. She pinned it carefully to a display plaque titled, What Remains, Legacy Reclaimed. By midday, the phone buzzed again. Navarro. It's done, he said. He's in custody. He's been read the charges. Julia sat on a bench near the window, sunlight washing over her face. No applause. No fireworks. Just peace. A silence deeper than betrayal. And stronger than any empire he ever tried to build. The courtroom wasn't dramatic like in the movies. No slamming gavels. No gasps from the gallery. Just the steady hum of bureaucracy and the weight of truth settling over worn wood and quiet breathing. Julia sat in the second row, her back straight, hands folded in her lap, watching the man who once called her his wife shuffle into the room in a gray suit that no longer fit him like armor. Brandon Cross looked smaller now. His tie was crooked, his posture defensive, and his eyes darted constantly as though searching for an exit that didn't exist. Julia had seen that look before, the moment he realized a deal had gone sour. Except this time, there was no deal. Just charges. And witnesses. The gallery wasn't packed, but word had spread. Whispers of the case had made it into the circles Brandon once dominated, art dealers, finance brokers, Charleston elites. Now they watched from a distance, some with pity, some with thinly disguised satisfaction. Julia ignored them all. Her focus remained on the judge, a sharp woman with silver-rimmed glasses and a reputation for zero tolerance toward fraud. Brandon Cross, the clerk read aloud, You are hereby charged with the following: grand larceny, fraudulent misrepresentation of estate, unlawful transfer of assets, identity falsification, and willful obstruction of financial investigation. How do you plead? Not guilty, Brandon said quickly, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Julia didn't flinch. The prosecution's argument was methodical, presenting the timeline of Brandon's actions, the forged estate name, the creation of Crestone Holdings, the illegal sale of high-value jewelry and artwork, and the laundering of funds through international shell accounts. They introduced the tracking data Julia had collected, the signed affidavits from auction houses, and the expert testimony from Detective Navarro. Every piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of Brandon's constructed world. When Navarro took the stand, Julia listened carefully as he recounted the investigation. Had Mrs. Emerson not embedded micro-tracking chips into her heirloom pieces, we may not have uncovered the wider laundering network in time, he said. Her actions, both personal and procedural, were pivotal to this case. Julia's chest tightened, not out of pride, but out of disbelief. This wasn't the life she chose, but it was the one she had to confront. Then it was her turn. As she stepped up to the witness stand, the room shifted. Every eye turned to her, but Julia focused only on the judge. Her voice was steady, her words deliberate. She told the story not of a stolen ring or a forged document, but of the erosion of trust. Of years spent believing in a man who saw her as a vault, not a partner. Of watching her legacy, her history, be packaged and sold behind her back. I did not come here today for revenge, Julia said softly. I came for restoration. For the truth to be recorded in the places where silence used to live. When she finished, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Brandon didn't look at her once. By the time the hearing ended, bail had been denied. Brandon was remanded to custody pending trial. Outside the courthouse, the sky was cloudless, but the air felt heavy. Reporters lingered near the gates, but Julia walked past them without a word. Tessa waited for her at the bottom of the stairs, holding her coat and a quiet, steady smile. You were incredible in there, she said. I wasn't trying to be, Julia replied. I just told the truth. Sometimes, the truth was enough. Over the next few days, the case remained on the news cycle. Julia's name wasn't splashed across headlines, but those who knew, really knew, began to reach out. Quiet calls from former colleagues. Texts from distant relatives who had heard only fragments of the story. Some apologized. Others congratulated her. A few said nothing but sent flowers to the gallery, anonymous but unmistakable in meaning. One afternoon, Julia received a letter. No return address. The handwriting was familiar, Brandon's. She almost threw it away. Instead, she opened it. Inside were 2 lines. I never thought you'd fight this hard. I guess I never really knew you. There was no apology. No remorse. Just recognition. She folded the letter in half and slid it into the back of her drawer, not to keep it, but to remind herself how far she'd come. That evening, she returned to the gallery to find a new delivery waiting, the last unrecovered piece. Her mother's emerald earrings. Found in a private safety deposit box registered under Crestone's false director. The courier handed over the sealed case and left without a word. Inside, the earrings sparkled like nothing had ever touched them. Untarnished. Unbroken. Julia held them in her palm and smiled, not for anyone else, but for herself. It was almost over. Not the pain. Not the betrayal. But the shadow of him. And what remained now was hers. Julia stood in front of the display wall at the Charleston Heritage Gallery, alone, long after the last visitor had trickled out. The gallery was closed for the evening, but she remained, surrounded not by strangers, but by stories. Her stories. Her mother's. Her grandmother's. The women who came before her, and the heirlooms that had outlived betrayal. The exhibit was titled What Remains, a Legacy Rewritten. It was quiet, powerful, and deeply personal. Each recovered piece was now part of a curated installation. The sapphire ring gleamed in a protective glass dome. The pearl comb lay nestled beside a sepia photograph of her grandmother, smiling during wartime in a dress far too elegant for the hardships she endured. The diamond pendant floated above a digital display, playing a looped video of Julia explaining the journey of recovery, not just of the jewels, but of her sense of self. Visitors walked through the exhibit in silence. Some cried. Others stared for minutes without saying a word. Julia had watched them all over the past few days, sometimes from the upper level, sometimes just beyond the door. None of them knew the full extent of what she had survived. That was fine. They didn't need to know the details to feel the weight. Tessa entered quietly, holding 2 cups of tea. "You've created something powerful," she said, handing one to Julia. "I didn't plan this," Julia murmured. "It just became what it needed to be." They walked through the gallery slowly, taking in the space. Newspaper clippings framed one wall. Emails redacted for court review were displayed in a minimal format beside app screenshots of the tracking interface. The cold evidence had become part of the art, no longer shameful, no longer sterile. Just honest. "I never thought healing could look like this," Julia admitted. Tessa gave a knowing smile. "Healing rarely looks the way we expect." Julia stopped in front of the emerald earrings. "They were the last to come back," she whispered. "The ones I thought were truly gone. And yet here they are," Tessa said softly. The gallery wasn't just an exhibit now. It was a reclamation. Every piece had been transformed from a symbol of theft into one of survival. What once adorned women for beauty now told a story of endurance, courage, and quiet fury. Later that night, Julia returned home to a message from Navarro. "Trial date is confirmed. 6 weeks. The financial analysts are confident. DA is building a bulletproof case ****. She stared at the message for a while before typing her reply. "Let me know if you need anything else from me." The next morning, Julia visited the lawyer's office to finalize the divorce. The paperwork was thick but precise. Her attorney, a kind woman named Miranda, walked her through every clause. "Once this is signed and filed," Miranda said, "you're free. All assets have been separated. You owe him nothing." Julia took the pen. Her hand hovered over the signature line for only a moment before she pressed ink to paper. It was done. Brandon was still in custody, awaiting trial. His face no longer appeared in news headlines, and he had disappeared from social media entirely. The man who once couldn't stop performing for the world had been stripped of his stage. And Julia? She was rebuilding. The house, once cold and filled with his energy, now breathed again. She had repainted the walls. Removed his remaining furniture. Replaced the heavy desk in the study with a writing table she had always wanted. The space felt clean. Honest. Hers. One evening, she hosted a small gathering. Not a party, just close friends, wine, and music. Tessa raised a glass during the toast. "To Julia, who taught all of us that reclaiming your story isn't just brave. It's necessary." Julia laughed quietly, her cheeks flushed. "To surviving what you thought might break you," she added. "And then turning the pieces into something beautiful." The room clinked glasses, and laughter filled the walls that had once held silence. Later that night, Julia sat on the back porch, a blanket around her shoulders, the sound of crickets in the distance. The moon cast a soft silver light across the garden. She opened her notebook, one she had been keeping since the beginning, each page filled with dates, details, memories, and things too sharp to say out loud. She turned to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote, "The cost of silence is too high. The truth is a loud, burning thing. But it is mine." And then she closed the book, placed it on her lap, and let herself breathe, not the shallow, guarded kind she had learned to live with, but a full, unshaken breath. The kind that meant she was still here. Still whole. And finally free. 6 weeks passed like pages in a windstorm. One by one, the pieces of the case came together, bank records, expert testimonies, international wire logs, and the silent glow of red dots on a tracking map that had once made Julia feel powerless, and now stood as her greatest weapon. The trial was scheduled for Monday morning in the Charleston District Courthouse. Word had spread far beyond the art world. Brandon Cross wasn't just on trial for theft, he was on trial for hubris, for believing he could forge an empire out of lies, manipulation, and a legacy that never belonged to him. Julia arrived before the courthouse opened. Navarro met her on the front steps with a quiet nod. He wore a charcoal suit, his badge clipped to his belt, and his presence steady as stone. "You ready for this?" he asked. She nodded. "More than I ever thought I could be." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Brandon's defense team had arrived early, a team of suited men and women who looked confident, but too polished, too rehearsed. Across the aisle, the district attorney reviewed their files, lips pursed in focused determination. Julia sat behind them, not at the center but not hidden. She didn't want to disappear into the shadows of this story. Not anymore. Brandon entered last, flanked by 2 guards. He no longer looked like the man she married. His shoulders were drawn in, his expression tight, his suit wrinkled at the collar. For the first time, he didn't scan the room to command it. He didn't search for her. He just looked tired. The opening arguments began, and the truth came pouring out. Prosecutors laid out the timeline, how Brandon had systematically drained Julia's collection through forged estate documents, falsified signatures, and illegal overseas accounts. They explained the structure of Crestone Holdings, how it was registered to a name that didn't exist, and how those funds had been washed through private auctions before disappearing into ghost investments. They showed the jury photographs of the jewelry, once lost, now recovered, displayed not just as evidence, but as artifacts of betrayal. When Navarro took the stand again, he was calm and clinical. He detailed how Julia's tracking system had been instrumental in breaking the laundering chain, and how further investigation revealed that Brandon had attempted similar schemes in the past under different aliases. Each revelation landed like a drumbeat, slow and devastating. Then came Julia's turn. She stepped into the witness box under the fluorescent courtroom lights. No notes. No scripts. Just the weight of her voice and the power of her truth. "I didn't come here to destroy anyone," she said, eyes locked on the jury. "I came to reclaim what was mine. Not just the jewelry. Not just my name. But the history that those pieces carried. The sacrifices of my mother, my grandmother." He tried to erase them, to profit off their memory like it was a business transaction. And for a while, I believed him. I believed in him. But silence has a price. And I've already paid enough. The courtroom was still. No one interrupted. No one whispered. Even Brandon's lawyers lowered their pens. Julia stepped down with her head held high. The defense team tried their best to spin the story. They painted Brandon as a misguided entrepreneur, someone desperate to save a failing business, who acted out of panic, not malice. They called witnesses who spoke of his charm, his ambition, his past success. But every word felt thin. Every excuse, rehearsed. When Brandon took the stand, his voice lacked the bravado that once filled rooms. He spoke in vague statements. Half-truths. He avoided Julia's eyes entirely. And when the prosecutor asked directly, "Did you forge your wife's signature on the estate transfer documents?" he hesitated too long. The courtroom felt the lie before he could say a word. The trial lasted 4 days. On the 5th, the jury returned with a verdict. Julia sat motionless as the foreperson stood. On the charge of grand larceny, guilty. On the charge of fraudulent misrepresentation, guilty. On the charge of identity falsification, guilty. On the charge of financial obstruction, guilty. On the charge of laundering through shell corporations, guilty. The room didn't erupt. It deflated. Like a balloon filled with too much silence, finally pierced. Brandon's shoulders dropped. His attorney lowered his eyes. And for the first time, Julia allowed herself to close her own. Not in exhaustion, but in release. Outside the courthouse, Navarro caught up with her. "It's over," he said simply. "No," Julia said, a soft smile touching her lips. "It's just finally beginning." That evening, the gallery held a private reception in her honor. Not to celebrate Brandon's fall, but to honor what had survived it. The pieces, now immortalized in her exhibit, shimmered under soft lighting. The plaque had been updated. Were covered, but not broken. These heirlooms were never about wealth. They were about memory, and the courage to protect it. Asterisk. Julia stood in front of the sapphire ring, the one that had been through war, loss, love, theft, and now, justice. She slipped it on her finger. It fit perfectly. As if it had never left her. Spring turned to early summer in Charleston, and the city, cloaked in Spanish moss and warm salt air, seemed to exhale with Julia. The trial was over. The headlines had slowed. The name Brandon Cross faded from whispers, becoming a cautionary tale of arrogance and downfall. But for Julia Emerson, the story wasn't ending. It was unfolding in an entirely new direction, one she was finally writing herself. She declined every interview. Every media appearance. Every podcast request from finance exposés or feminist channels asking how she triumphed. Because it wasn't about a triumph. It was about a slow return to herself. What Brandon didn't realize when he tried to destroy her was that Julia had never relied on noise or spectacle. Her strength came in silence, the silence of knowing. Of waiting. Of watching long enough for the fire to reveal what it would burn and what it could never touch. It had taken nearly every part of her, her trust, her marriage, her peace, but not her name. Not her purpose. Julia returned to the gallery only part-time. Instead, she began working with smaller museums across the Southeast, helping to catalog and digitally preserve heirloom jewelry from marginalized communities, pieces that had never been appraised by markets but were priceless to the people who carried them. She traveled to towns where families welcomed her like a daughter, where worn velvet boxes held stories worth more than gold. And she always brought her scanner. Navarro stayed in touch. Occasionally, he would visit the gallery for events, dressed awkwardly in semi-formal wear, always grumbling about the lack of good bourbon at art receptions. But his presence was grounding. When they shared drinks on her porch, watching the fireflies blink to life, there was no need for small talk. He had become something rare, someone who understood what silence meant. Tessa, ever bold, moved on fast. She sold her digital marketing firm, opened a small wine bar in Asheville, and named one of the house cocktails the Velvet Trap. Julia laughed when she saw the menu. It was cherry red and bitter, with a sugar rim. Poetic justice, Tessa said. But the real shift happened one quiet evening, nearly a year later. Julia received a letter. Not from Brandon. She hadn't heard from him since the sentencing. He was serving 9 years, no parole for at least 5. No apologies had come, and she expected none. The letter was from Geneva. It was written on thick stationery with embossed lettering. The woman who had once bought her grandmother's stolen brooch had learned the truth and, moved by the trial coverage, contacted the Charleston Gallery directly. She'd offered to return the brooch, no compensation required. But she'd also done something else. Inside the envelope, Julia found a deed. To a small art cottage on the lakefront of Montreux, Switzerland. I believe pieces belong with their rightful keeper, Geneva had written. And sometimes, the story needs a quiet place to be rewritten. I hope this is yours. Julia stood in her kitchen, hand trembling, as she stared out the window at the quiet world she had rebuilt, not on rage, not on revenge, but on truth. Brandon had taken so much. But he had unknowingly lit the match that burned down the illusions. And through that fire, she had found clarity, strength, and a trail back to the woman she had buried beneath compromise. Weeks later, she flew to Montreux. The cottage was small, nestled beside a crystalline lake, framed by pine and silence. Inside, the walls were whitewashed, the shelves bare, a clean slate. She unpacked slowly. One velvet box at a time. She placed her grandmother's ring on the mantel. Her mother's pendant on the hook beside the mirror. A small framed photograph of herself, from the opening day of the exhibit, next to the window. And she opened her notebook, blank pages waiting. Outside, the sun was setting in ribbons of coral and soft gold. Julia Emerson sat in the light, no longer a woman scorned, betrayed, or broken. She was the woman who watched the fire burn, and rose from the ashes carrying everything that mattered. The heirlooms. The story. And herself.